touches on mathematics in various ways. I teach research methods to Masters of Education students. I also teach on a program for senior teachers called the Master of Secondary School Leadership, in which I run a course on assessment literacy. And I have in the past also taught on foundation programs for mathematics. Something that I observe, especially in my master's courses, on a regular basis, successful middle-aged teachers who have a terror of the most basic mathematics. I've had literally senior teachers in tears, not having even confronted the work, but just in anticipation of confronting it. It is mortal terror. And that's something that's of great concern to me, and it's become clear to me that one must address the emotional problem before one can make progress with learning. But I'm also interested in why this is. Why mathematics in particular? And I think my reflections thus far are that more than any other subject, it's a building blocks thing. That there are a series of steps to engaging in a mathematical concept where the precursors have to be in place in order for the learning to be sound. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. What the cognitive psychology evidence tells us about that and why it is so important to solidify each step before we move on. And then I'll talk about the implications of that for the way that we assess, especially internal assessment in NCEA. And I hasten to add that the problem isn't unique to NCEA. I mean, the teachers I'm talking about never did NCEA, they did school certificate and other things like that. But I think there are some aspects of the NCEA assessment system that can exacerbate the problem if we're not very careful. So, human cognitive processes can be broadly broken into two categories. And this is work that goes back to the 1980s. The psychologist Jerry Fodor published a book called Modularity of Mind, in which he made a distinction between fast or automatic processes that function without effort or attention, and then relatively slow processes that require attentional focus and conscious monitoring. I will give you an illustration of automaticity right now. So what I'm going to show you is some words, and what I want you to do is not read the word, but tell me the colour of the font as quickly as you can. Just call it out when you see it.
Red. Yellow. Green. Blue.
Do you notice people a bit slower on ones that don't match? Well, why is that? It's because you can't help reading the word. You're all skilled readers. When you see a word, you don't have to, in fact, even though it's counterproductive to the task at hand, you process the meaning of that word. And it interferes with you saying the colour that I asked you to say. You're all skilled readers. So that's an example of an automatic cognitive process. You literally can't control it. You can't not look at a word and not read it, not process its meaning to a certain level. Now, of course, you didn't start off in life being skilled readers. And for a beginning reader, reading the word red, well, it's a different process entirely. Say they're using a phonics strategy. Well, first of all, they've got to recognise each letter. I've got a 4-year-old daughter who's engaged in this at the moment, and it's a very slow, deliberate process. Having recognised the letter, you've got to map the phoneme to it. Now, what's that sound associated with this one? Yeah, good. And then you've got to blend it together with a red. And that is the slow and deliberate process of learning to read. So what starts off as a conscious, attention-demanding, difficult process becomes fluid with practice. To the point of complete automaticity, which you all demonstrated for yourselves just a minute ago. And, of course, reading is not alone amongst that sort of process. In fact, you could say that all learning is like that to some extent, but especially learning that deals with skill processes, of which I would argue mathematics is one. Things like driving. When we all started to drive, we, those of us who learn to drive manual cars, the thing of bunny hop when we fail to get the clutch and sync with the accelerator, gear stick and so on. And now, you know, having driven for 30 or 35 years, I don't even think about it. It's an automatic process. Obviously one's paying attention to the road conditions, but the actual process of steering and, you know, you do it without having to concentrate too much. Playing music is another, you know. Skilled musicians have spent thousands of hours playing scales and exercises to get their bodies, their minds, their musical ear trained to the point where they don't have to worry about all of that and they can concentrate on expressing the music. So if we go to the psychological research and literature on this phenomenon, we find a very influential theory called the working memory theory. Alan Baddeley is the great champion of it. He first started writing about it in the 1970s. Baddeley and Hitch was the seminal paper, but then Baddeley's book Working Memory in 1986 lays out really what has become the foundation for understanding this kind of process. And under the original conception, Baddeley proposed what he called a central processor, which, well, I'll explain what that does in a minute, but it has various systems hanging off it. Short-term memory systems, one for phonological or language-based information, another for visuospatial information. And in a later modification, he added what he called an episodic store. And I'll explain what each of those are in turn. So what the central processor does, you can almost think of it as the contents of consciousness at any given minute. So it directs attention to the task at hand, what needs to be done now, what needs to be attended to, what information needs to be taken in. It coordinates the cognitive processes required to undertake a task. It suppresses irrelevant information because, of course, whenever we're in an environment like this, there's almost an infinity of possible sensory information we could be taking in, but our attention is paid to what is of importance at the time. So something there is inhibiting the information that is not relevant. And it coordinates the short-term subsystems I was talking about, the first of which, phonological store. Well, okay, so that's a short-term store that holds basically sound information associated with the language. And in addition to the actual store, there's a rehearsal mechanism to maintain the information in there. And that's an attention-demanding process. It doesn't happen without it, but it is not automatic. The visuospatial store, okay? So that deals with visual and spatial information, and the research evidence shows that there are probably two sub-stores, one for feature information like colour and shape, and another for spatial location. The episodic store, well, that mediates primarily the relationship with long-term memory. So when we're performing tasks, quite often we have to draw on what we already know. And this short-term episodic store acts as an interface between long-term memory and the working memory system as we perform tasks. So that's a depiction of the model that I just talked about, with the central processor in the centre with these other stores which feed information to the central processor as well as having information fed to them to hold in temporary storage. Now, all of these are capacity limited. They can't hold much information at a time, and it has to be held with conscious effort. It doesn't just stay there. If somebody tells you a telephone number, right, and you want to remember it, well, it doesn't immediately, unless you've got an absolutely incredible memory, get committed to long-term memory. And you find yourself repeating it, perhaps, to maintain the sequence of digits in your phonological store. Or you might try to call to mind somebody's face. Well, that is stored in your long-term memory. And when you call it to mind, well, it might come through the episodic store and then end up in your short-term visual store. While you concentrate on remembering the features of that person's face, it'll sit there. But as soon as you think about something else, it'll get flushed out and other information will supplant it. So these are short-term and capacity-limited systems. And they're necessarily so because a novel task, one that we're not used to performing, requires a lot of processing. It requires a lot of brain power, if you will. Whereas once something has become highly practiced, it's as it were probably literally hardwired into the brain. And so it no longer requires that degree of attention and concentration to execute it. So I'll just fill you in on some of the evidence about how we measure the capacity of those subsystems. We know quite a lot about them, and there's a massive, massive literature on it, massive research literature. So the change detection task is a really good kind of paradigm for measuring the capacities of these systems. So, and I'll show you one in a minute. And we can have both visual ones and phonological ones. So in the visual case, we might have an array of some sort of pattern, some sort of patterns with various objects within that array. And then we'll have an interval during which you have to store that information. So we'll have an interval of a few seconds perhaps where nothing is presented. You just have to maintain a visual image of that information that you've seen. And then there'll be a test stimulus which will be presented at just one of the locations where the objects in the original array. And your task is simply to say whether it was the same or different than the element of the study array that was presented at that location. And then by varying the size of the study array, we can estimate the capacity of the store, because the more elements there are to remember, obviously the more challenged your system is going to be. And so once the array exceeds the capacity of the store, it becomes more likely that you will fail to store the relevant element and your performance will drop. In the phonological case, instead of a series of, or an array of patterns, you might have a series of phonologically labelled non-words, like fut or something like that. And you have a sequence of those that you have to store, and then again you have a test stimulus after an interval and you have to say, was that part of the sequence or not? And by varying the number of non-words in the sequence, we can estimate the capacity of the phonological store. And in general, I mean, we find that capacity varies across individuals, and it also varies to some extent with the kind of stimulus we're talking about. Some stimuli can be chunked together, and there are various complications to it. But in general, between about 4 and about 7 objects or representations of objects can be stored at once in any one of these stores. So here's an example of what the change detection task might look like. These are called gargoyle patches, and they're stimuli with particularly good properties for doing this, because what we want to do is measure the capacity of the visual store. So we don't want to use things that people can attach a verbal label to, because if they did, they could use their phonological store instead. These patches vary in spatial frequency, that is how quickly the stripes change from light to dark across them. So there's an array of 4, and then there'd be a blank interval. Now you're storing that information, and then we see a test patch, and the task is to say whether that's the same or different as the element that appeared at that location in the study array. It's a more challenging task than you might think. So, what I'll do now is give you an example of the way in which the working memory system might be used to solve an arithmetic problem. And this will be at a certain stage of arithmetic development. Okay? So what we're assuming is that the person solving this problem has already got stored in their long-term memory some basic facts about the sums of small small numbers, like one-digit numbers, they'll know automatically, as it were, that 7 plus 6 is 13. That's just something that gets evoked, as it were, automatically. Now, when I talk about automaticity, there are degrees of it. Okay, so the example I showed you before with word recognition, that was an example of a process you can't suppress. You can't fully suppress. And you saw the evidence of that because it interfered with the task that you're asked to do. Whether or not you can suppress 7 plus 6 equals 13 is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. You may or may not be able to, but it's automatic enough that it's at your fingertips. You don't have to think about it. So the problem here is 37 plus 49, and somebody might be asked to solve this in their heads. Okay, so the first thing is that the central processor will focus on the problem. Okay, there's all these stimuli in the environment, but what we want here is 37 times 49, so let's think about that. Okay, first thing we can do is sum the units, 7 plus 9. Okay, well that gets passed off to the episodic store, 7 plus 9, and that then interfaces with long-term memory, where that is, as it were, automatically retrievable. And that gets passed back to the episodic store, whereupon the central processor says, all right, now we've got to store the unit element of that solution, as well as the carrier, and those are separate things because we need to separate them. This is going to be the unit, the 6 is going to be the unit element of the solution, whereas the 1 has to be stored in order to be added to some of the 10s once we've got back. So in this case, I'm going to say it puts that in the phonological store, so we have, as it were, a sound image of 6 carried to 1 that gets held there. It could equally perhaps go into the visual store, and there's evidence that either one is possible. And then the central processor says, well, okay, the next task is to sum the 10s, 3 plus 4. And again, it will use the episodic system to retrieve that from long-term memory and get 7. Pass back to the episodic store, whereupon the central processor retrieves the carrier from the phonological store and says, now it's time to add it to the 10's solution 7, once again from long-term memory. And so finally, it retrieves the unit solution from the phonological subsystem and assembles the solution 86. So that seems like a long and deliberate process, and for somebody not very skilled in addition, it may be literally that complex. But even for those of us who can do pretty quickly a sum like 37 plus 49 in our heads, that kind of process is going on, it just happens very quickly. It's become almost automatized for people who are very skilled in arithmetic. And in fact, if you do an awful lot of this sort of thing, even 2-digit numbers may be retrieved from long-term memory. Once we got to adding 2 4-digit numbers, it would be a different story. And that would start to challenge all of us. Because we all have a limited capacity, and we all have a limitation to what we've automatized. I have a PhD student, Di Wei, who's done work in this area, and she used the dual task approach with the sorts of arrays I showed you before to assess the involvement of working memory subsystems in the storage of carrier information, just as I've just modelled with those diagrams. So the way this works is that you have the change detection task, you look at the study array, those garbled patches, then you get an arithmetic task to do, while you're still storing the stuff from the array. You perform the arithmetic task, and of course if you're using the working memory system to do the arithmetic task, it's going to interfere with your storage of the array information. And so by comparing performance and the change detection between when you're just doing that and when you're doing an arithmetic task as well, we can estimate the degree of involvement of the working memory subsystem in the arithmetic task. And what Wei showed is that the number of carriers modulates the degree of interference. So the more carriers you have, the more you impact on change detection and performance. And she showed that with both visual arrays and phonological strings of non-words. So she has evidence that both systems are involved. She looked at both addition and multiplication tasks and found similar results for both. So this is just by way of showing that even mathematical processes that come well before algebra and things like that for students require this process of attention, practice, automatisation. And in fact, learning skills, such as mathematical skills, we can see as an iterative process. So when we first encounter a new aspect of the skill, it requires a lot of attention and working memory resources. We haven't done this much before. We haven't made it fluid. It's not hardwired in our brains yet how you do this. We haven't got the representations or all of the representations we need in long-term memory to support it. So there's a lot of attention that has to be paid at the conscious level to working it out. But with practice, we get long-term semantic and procedural representations formed, which free our working memory resources to approach the next more advanced aspect of what we're doing. Now, when I say semantic and procedural representations, a semantic representation is one like a number or an object that has a meaning, it could be a word, etc. Whereas a procedural representation is something you do. It's more like the driving analogy the driving example where you're steering without having to concentrate on how you turn the wheel or something like that, or playing the violin, you've mastered the bowing. It's a procedural representation. And I think mathematics has both of those things, by the way. I think there's a procedural element to mathematics as well as semantic elements. And of course, having approached the next most advanced aspect with increasing practice, that too becomes automatised. And so you have mathematicians in the world who can do all sorts of astounding feats in their head just like that, and that's how they become the world's leading mathematicians, because they're able to have automatised so much that the most abstract of things become accessible to them. So let's move ahead to something that might be more of relevance to a high school student approaching an algebraic problem. So in this case, they might have a task to expand this expression. Now, of course, there are rules for expanding double brackets, whereby we have to get 4 elements out of that. And I remember when I first approached that when I was 14 or something like that, it seemed a bit odd. And it's something that has to be demonstrated and you get your head around it over time, and then it becomes automatic. Well, if it doesn't become automatic, the problem is that it interferes with doing the task. They're not fluent with doing that sort of problem yet. So if they haven't automatised procedurally the rules for expanding double parentheses, probably, as I say, in long-term procedural memory, the rule has to be retrieved more deliberately from episodic memory and held perhaps in a working memory subsystem, while they figure out how to do it. And that would reduce the cognitive resources available for solving the problem itself. So that's an example of that. And you can think of hundreds of examples quite quickly if you sit down with the sorts of tasks that students do and analyse how they might go about it when they haven't approached that kind of problem before. So, the implications of this for mathematics pedagogy, well, they're at least twofold. And these things impact on the NCEA assessment approach. So, first of all, practice to the point of automatisation is critical for learning mathematical procedures. Because if you don't, you won't have the cognitive resources free to grasp the novel element of something, or the next step, as it were. If we forge ahead with material before students have mastered the foundations of it, their working memory systems will become overloaded. And I think that promotes anxiety. When you're in a situation where you're overwhelmed with information, there is an anxiety that kicks in that impacts on self-efficacy. It results in the sort of long-term, I don't think it's short of the truth to call it trauma that I've observed in the sorts of people I was talking about before. So I think it's absolutely critical to see that students do enough practice on the foundations of a concept before they start to build on those foundations. And the other issue that I have is that complicating factors like contextualized problems should be avoided until the mathematics procedures required to solve them have been automatized. For similar reasons, because the contextual elements bring in another layer of complication that has to be stored. They have to map between the mathematical concepts required and the elements of the context that those concepts relate to. And I think that our present approach to internal assessment for NCEA mathematics disincentivises both of those imperatives. I don't think that internal assessment promotes sufficient practice. This isn't to say that individual teachers don't or couldn't, but the assessment system itself doesn't promote sufficient practice to encode information or to automatise critical procedures. And of course we have this requirement from the Ministry of Education that problems are contextualised. In addition, I think we have this menu of standards that we pick and choose from that can result in students not being exposed to all of the critical building blocks required to build on at the next level. In other words, gaps in their knowledge in the curriculum they experience. So here's an example from a level 1. This is downloaded from TKI. It's promoted as a good task to use with whatever modifications one might make. And it's a linear algebra task. So it's about traveling at the airport and you're comparing 3 taxi companies and they've all got, there's a little table of, charges per distance there, so you can build an equation for each one. And then you solve the system of equations and answer these questions. Okay. Straightforward enough if you know what you're doing, but you've got to interpret this context. But first of all, on the practice front, the assessment itself only requires the solution of a single system of linear equations. That's all. Now, presumably, students will have done some practice before they approach it. However, and I'm not, cards on the table, I'm not a massive fan of time-limited exams, but what we have here is a stipulation they have to work independently, but there isn't a time limit, and they can consult reference materials. In other words, they can go off and do it however they can do it. And so that absolutely does not promote them practicing to the point of automatisation or remotely anything like that. Some might, and you might have teachers who really see that as important and do it, but there's nothing in the assessment system that incentivises that or drives towards it. And I think the resubmissions policy makes that worse, because if they don't get it the first time, well, okay, maybe they get coached a bit and then, okay, we'll just adjust it and add a product. The concept won't be solid. And the context, as I've said, it adds an additional complication. Especially if they're struggling with the mathematical concept, then mapping it onto the real world context is a complication they absolutely don't need at that time. I don't know why anybody thinks that contexts make things easier. I have no idea. Instead, it's much more likely that working memory gets overloaded and they get confused. So, here's my series of proposals for NCEA. I think we've got to cease awarding credits during the year. I think it's a failed experiment. I know why we wanted to do it in the first place, to provide motivation and so on, but it's resulted in all sorts of bad behaviours. like, I've got enough credits now, so I'm going to stop. That's one thing. But apart from that, the imperative to credit count all the time focuses on the wrong things. And that's to some extent teachers as well as students. And I've actually come to the conclusion that that teachers should still run assessments, if there is internal assessments. There's lots of good things you can get out of them, but not be required to mark them. We should have an online platform where they can be submitted to NCEA, marked at the end of the year by panels, just as exams are. That starts to address some of the teacher workload issues regarding NCEA, as well as introducing a much greater consistency to the way internal assessments will be marked. Courses should not be a series of standards as if they were curriculum units. You know, in mathematics we have standards that ought to really be, well, the standards assess content that ought to be deployed across an entire course, not just as a sort of potted part of it. And I don't think there's any need for a one-to-one mapping between assessment tasks and standards. That's a more complicated issue that we can talk about in question time if anyone's interested in raising it. This is key. Assessment should require students to do enough practice to automatise key processes. And I don't think this problem is new to NCEA. I think it's always been with us to an extent. Perhaps a portfolio approach could assist that by demonstrating a persistence of a skill over time, that it's not just they could do it on this day, but actually they've been able to do it and use it and build on it. And that even if the standards themselves, if an assessment task must, by fiat from the agencies, require contextualisation, it's not necessary that all elements of task need that. And perhaps we ought to have an approach. I mean, I guess if I was tasked with teaching an NCEA class, I'd be thinking to myself, okay, before we even get to the assessment, I'm going to have a series of assignments which are not for credits as such, but they build the skills that are required to do the actual internal assessment. How you motivate students to do that is another question, and perhaps discuss that as well. Thank you.